When they fought over my mother's money, I didn't say a word. I just stood there, near the window of her small suburban home, while my two older siblings shouted about who deserved what. The lawyer sat awkwardly at the dining table, pretending not to hear the bitterness spilling across the room. I remember thinking, she's not even buried yet, and already they were dividing her things. My mother, Eleanor, was a quiet woman. She loved her roses, her morning coffee, and the sound of old country music playing softly from the kitchen radio. I used to come by every weekend when I could. Sometimes, I missed a few. Work, meetings, the usual excuses. But I never ignored her completely. I couldn't. She raised us alone after Dad passed. 3 kids, 1 small house, and a life held together by patience. My brother, Mark, always thought he was the smartest. My sister, Diane, played the victim whenever things didn't go her way. Me, I just tried to stay out of the mess. But when Mom fell sick, everything changed. Mark and Diane suddenly became concerned children. They took turns visiting her, posting pictures online, making it look like they were the ones who cared. But when it came to hospital bills, they disappeared. Mom never complained. She said, "They're busy, honey. Everyone helps in their own way." She believed in goodness, even when it hurt her. The day she passed, I felt something inside me go quiet. I wasn't angry. Just hollow. Like a room after everyone leaves. The silence doesn't just stay, it grows. At the funeral, Mark stood beside the priest, pretending to wipe tears that weren't there. Diane wore a black dress that looked more like a costume than mourning. I buried my hands in my coat pockets and tried to focus on her face in the casket, peaceful, as if she'd finally escaped the noise of us. Afterward, when the lawyer read her will, I learned something that stunned me. She had divided her modest savings, around $40,000, equally among the 3 of us. But there was a note attached. A single sentence, written in her delicate handwriting. Use this money to do something good. Not just for yourself, but for the person you become after I'm gone. Mark laughed when he heard that. Well, Mom knew I'm the one who actually knows how to use money, he said, folding the paper like it meant nothing. Diane nodded along, already talking about a new car. I just sat there, quiet, running my fingers over her words. Something about that sentence stayed with me. Maybe it was the way she said after I'm gone. Like she knew her absence would test us more than her presence ever did. Weeks passed. The house grew silent. Mark sold his portion of Mom's home to Diane and moved out of state. Diane, despite her big talk, stopped answering calls. She said she was too busy, starting fresh. And I stayed. I kept the part of the house that mattered, the garden. Her roses. The place where she used to hum old songs while pruning the stems. At night, I'd make coffee and sit by the window. The same window I stood near when they argued about her money. And every time the wind brushed through those roses, I could almost hear her voice again. Calm. Gentle. Forgiving. That's when I decided, I wouldn't fight them. I wouldn't prove who cared more. Life would do that for me. And it did, just not the way I expected. I grew up in that same old house on Maple Street. The paint on the porch was always peeling, and the wooden steps creaked every time you walked up. But for me, that sound was home. It was the music of my childhood, imperfect, familiar, real. Mom used to say, a house only feels empty when the people inside forget to love each other. I didn't understand it back then. But now, sitting alone years later, her words make too much sense. Mark was the oldest, 5 years older than me. He was always chasing more. Bigger cars, better jobs, and people who could help him climb faster. He had a way with words, charming but slippery. Even as kids, he'd make deals with us. He'd trade chores for candy, or convince me to do his part in exchange for promises he never kept. Diane was different. She wanted attention, not power. She'd cry if she didn't get it. When she got older, she learned how to turn those tears into tools. She could make people feel guilty without saying much. I used to think she was fragile, but I later learned she was just careful about where her weaknesses showed. Mom loved them both, maybe more than they deserved. She used to defend them even when they were wrong. "They're your brother and sister," she'd say softly. "One day, you'll understand why I never argue back." I do now. She believed love wasn't meant to be measured by fairness. When Dad died, I was 14. Mark was already working part-time at a car dealership, and Diane had just started high school. Mom took a job at the local diner to keep us afloat. She'd leave before sunrise, wearing her brown coat and carrying that little blue lunchbox she never replaced. Every night, she came home smelling of coffee and fried food, but she'd still smile. She'd hum old songs while cooking dinner, her energy never fading no matter how tired she was. I used to ask her, "Why don't you ever rest, Mom?" She'd laugh. "Because if I stop moving, I'll start thinking. And if I start thinking, I'll start missing your dad again." That was her way of surviving, staying busy. Years later, when I finally got a steady job in the city, I wanted to take care of her. I offered to pay off the house, maybe move her somewhere quieter. But she refused. "This house saw your first steps," she said. "I'll stay here until it forgets my footsteps." Mark and Diane rarely visited after they moved out. Mark said his job was too demanding. Diane claimed her husband didn't like small-town life. Still, Mom would call them every Sunday. I'd overhear her half of the conversation, gentle questions, laughter that tried too hard, and pauses that lasted too long. She always hung up smiling. But when she turned away, her shoulders looked a little heavier. Then came the year everything started to fade. It began with small things. She'd forget to turn off the stove. She'd leave the garden hose running all night. Once, she called me in tears because she couldn't remember where she'd parked her car, only to realize later she hadn't driven that day. The doctor said it was early-stage dementia. I remember sitting beside her in the hospital, trying to stay calm while she stared at the floor. "Is it bad?" she asked quietly. I took her hand. "We'll manage, Mom. You're not alone." She smiled faintly. "Good. I've been alone before. I don't want to do it again." I promised her I'd help. I meant it. But promises are easy when life isn't testing you. Work started pulling me deeper, long hours, constant travel. I'd call her every other day, but visits became harder. Mark and Diane said they'd check in, but they rarely did. When they did visit, they'd post photos, smiling beside her as if love could be captured in a frame. Sometimes, she'd call me late at night, confused. "Michael, your father hasn't come home yet," she'd whisper. I'd remind her gently, "Mom, Dad's been gone a long time." She'd pause, then laugh softly, embarrassed. "Oh right. Silly me. It just feels like he's late." Those calls tore through me. I started visiting every weekend again, bringing groceries and helping her with bills. Mark would drop by once every few months, usually asking about the house, how much it was worth, whether she'd ever consider selling. Diane came only on holidays, always leaving early, always complaining about how small-town life smelled like sadness. Mom never said a bad word about them. She only said, everyone shows love in their own way. But deep down, I think she knew the truth. When her health declined further, I suggested hiring a nurse. Mark said it was too expensive. Diane said it would make Mom feel like a burden. So I took more days off work, juggling bills, responsibilities, and guilt. Sometimes, I'd find her sitting in the garden, talking to Dad's photograph. Once, I overheard her saying, "They'll be fine without me. I just hope they remember me kindly." I wanted to tell her they would, but I didn't trust my voice to say it without breaking. The last month of her life was quiet. Too quiet. She stopped humming, stopped gardening. Even her favorite radio station didn't play anymore. She just sat by the window, watching the street. Every time I visited, she'd smile like she'd been waiting her whole life just to see me again. On her final morning, I made her breakfast. She barely ate. She looked out the window and said softly, "Promise me you won't argue with them when I'm gone." I frowned. Why would I argue? She smiled faintly. Because love becomes fragile when money enters the room. She passed away 2 days later. Peacefully. At the funeral, I remembered that last line again. I didn't know how right she'd be. Because the moment her body was laid to rest, my siblings' true colors started showing. And that's where the quiet storm began. The kind that doesn't rage outside, but inside the walls of a family that's forgotten how to love. After the funeral, the world didn't stop. It never does. People came, said the usual kind words, brought casseroles, then went back to their lives. I stayed behind to clean the house. Her scent still lingered on the curtains, her shoes still rested by the door. I couldn't bring myself to move them. The day after, Mark called. "Hey Mike," he began, his voice too casual for the moment. "So, about the house. We should probably decide what to do with it." I stared at the phone. "It's only been 2 days." "I know," he said quickly. "I'm just saying, it's better to handle these things while everything's fresh. You know, before legal stuff gets complicated." Legal stuff. That's all she had become to him, a case file. Diane joined the conversation a few hours later, insisting we sell it before it loses value. She said keeping it would trap us in the past. I wanted to tell them that the past was the only thing left of her. But instead I said, "I'll think about it." They both sighed in unison, the kind of sigh people make when they believe they're smarter than you. That week, Mark sent me an email with property appraisal in the subject line. Attached was a document listing the house's value, his signature already marked at the bottom. Diane's too. I was the only one who hadn't signed. He called again. "Mike, don't make this harder than it has to be. Mom wouldn't want us fighting." I almost laughed. "You mean she wouldn't want you fighting me?" There was silence on the line. Then, in that smooth corporate tone he used when selling cars, he said, "Look, I know you were close to her, but emotions don't pay bills. Let's be adults about it." "Adults," I repeated softly. "Sure." When I hung up, I felt the same quiet ache I'd felt at the funeral. Not anger. Just disappointment that ran too deep to express. They wanted money. I wanted peace. And peace, I learned, costs more than any house. Over the next few months, I watched them circle like vultures. Mark started spreading rumors among relatives that I was stalling the process. Diane told anyone who'd listen that I was trying to control everything. I didn't defend myself. Let people believe what they wanted. Instead, I focused on the garden. Her roses were blooming again, despite the neglect. It amazed me how something so delicate could survive storms, frost, and time. Maybe that's why she loved them. They were proof that beauty can endure pain. One afternoon, I found an old notebook on her bedside table. Inside were pages of notes, grocery lists, recipes, reminders to call Michael. But near the end, I found something else. A letter she never sent. "If they ever fight after I'm gone, tell them I forgive them already. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means I hope life teaches them gently what I could not." That sentence burned itself into my heart. I folded the page and kept it in my wallet. It reminded me that revenge wasn't always about winning. Sometimes it was about waiting, quietly, patiently, for truth to reveal itself. A few weeks later, Mark drove down from Chicago. He arrived in a shiny SUV, sunglasses on, looking like success. Diane came too, wearing an expensive coat and her usual perfume that filled the room before she even spoke. We sat in Mom's living room, the same place where she used to serve us lemonade on summer afternoons. But now, the air felt different. Heavy. Cold. Mark cleared his throat. "Let's make this simple. Diane and I agreed to sell the house. We'll split it 3 ways, clean and fair." "Fair?" I asked quietly. "Fair would have been visiting her when she needed you." Diane rolled her eyes. Oh, come on, Mike. Don't make this emotional. Everyone deals with grief differently. I looked at her. Some deal with it by ignoring it. Mark leaned forward, smiling, that salesman's smile again. Look, you've got your job, your apartment, your own life. Why hang on to this old place? It's just walls and wood. I took a slow breath. To you, maybe. To me, it's her voice, her laughter, her life. You can't sell that. He shrugged. Fine. Then buy us out. I looked up. Buy you out? Yeah, he said. You can keep the house if you pay us our share of its value. We already had it appraised. Comes to about $28,000 each. I almost smiled. You're serious? Completely, he said. You've got a good job. Shouldn't be hard. Diane crossed her arms. It's the fair thing to do. I wanted to argue, but I didn't. I knew exactly what they were doing, pushing me into a corner, hoping I'd cave. Instead, I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. Then I said calmly, all right. Give me 6 months. Mark blinked. 6 months. Yes. I'll pay both of you your share. But once I do, this house, and everything in it, is mine alone. No claims, no memories, no visits. They exchanged a glance, probably thinking they'd won. Deal, Mark said, extending his hand. I shook it without flinching. Because what they didn't know, what they never understood, was that I'd already learned the quiet art of patience from the woman they ignored. Those 6 months changed everything. While they spent their money on new things, I saved every penny. I sold my car, moved closer to work, and worked extra hours. It wasn't easy, but it felt right, like I was protecting something sacred. In that time, I also started something small, a flower stall. It began with her roses. I'd cut them, wrap them, and sell them outside the office district on weekends. People loved them, said they smelled like real flowers, not the kind grown in greenhouses. Soon, I started growing more, lilies, tulips, daisies. The garden she'd loved so much became my quiet business. The same hands that once watered those flowers in her memory were now shaping my future. By the 5th month, I had more than enough to pay them both. Mark looked surprised when I sent the bank transfer. Didn't think you'd actually do it, he said. I always do what I say, I replied. He laughed. Good for you. Hope it's worth it. It was. Worth every dollar. But that wasn't the end. That was just the beginning of how life quietly turned the tables. A year later, I expanded the flower stall into a small floral shop. I named it Eleanor's Garden. Customers came not just for flowers, but for the peace that lingered in the air. The shop became known for its calm atmosphere. People said walking in felt healing. I never told them why. One afternoon, as I was arranging bouquets, Diane walked in. She looked different, tired, thinner, her eyes restless. Mike, she said softly. I heard about your shop. I smiled faintly. Word travels fast. She hesitated. Listen, I could use some help. My husband left. Things aren't great. I was wondering if maybe. Diane, I interrupted gently. You once told me the past traps people. Remember? Her face flushed. I didn't mean. I know, I said calmly. But this place, this house, this garden, it saved me. I can't save anyone else with it. She nodded slowly, realizing that forgiveness doesn't always mean returning to what broke you. 2 months later, Mark called. His business had collapsed. He needed a loan. I listened quietly, leaning against the counter, surrounded by the smell of roses. Mike, you've done well for yourself, he said. Help me out just this once. For a moment, I thought about Mom, about how she'd tell me to be kind. And so I said, I can't give you money, Mark. But I'll give you something Mom gave me, patience. You'll need it now. He hung up without another word. That night, as I closed the shop, I stood in the garden. The same wind brushed through the roses, and I realized, the silence that once hurt me now felt peaceful. Mom was right. Love becomes fragile when money enters the room. But peace grows when you stop chasing fairness and start trusting time. Life has a strange rhythm. It doesn't always reward those who rush. Sometimes it waits, watches, and balances things in its own quiet way. That's what I started to understand during the second year after Mom's death. The flower shop had grown, slowly, honestly. I opened early, closed late, and treated every bouquet like a message. People came from nearby towns just to order flowers that feel alive. I never advertised. The best things in life don't need to shout. Behind the shop was still her garden, the same patch of earth she once called her peace. I kept it exactly how she liked it. Roses along the fence, daisies by the steps, and the small bench where she used to read. Sometimes I'd sit there with my coffee, close my eyes, and feel her presence, not in some spiritual way, but in memory. I didn't realize then that the quiet life I'd built was slowly becoming my revenge. Not the bitter kind, but the kind that humbles those who once thought you were nothing without them. It started with Mark. He called me one afternoon out of the blue. His voice didn't carry the confidence it used to. "Hey, Mike. Long time." "Yeah," I said, keeping my tone even. "How are you holding up?" There was a pause. Then a shaky laugh. "Not great. The market's bad. Lost a couple of dealerships. You know how it is." I didn't know. I'd never gambled with people's trust like he had. He sighed. "Listen. I might have been hard on you before. About the house. But you did good with it. I can see that now." "That house was Mom's heart," I said quietly. "You can't buy something like that." "I know," he said softly. "Guess I learned that the hard way." I could hear him trying not to sound defeated. Pride still wrapped around his voice like an old coat that didn't fit anymore. "I'm starting over," he continued. "Smaller place, fewer people. Maybe that's what I needed all along." "I hope it brings you peace," I said. He laughed again, hollow this time. "Peace. Yeah. I used to think success meant not having to ask for it." Before hanging up, he said something I'll never forget. "You were right to stay quiet, Mike. The world catches up to people like me eventually." When the call ended, I sat for a while, thinking about how my mother used to say, "Time doesn't punish, it teaches." Maybe that was what was happening. Life wasn't punishing Mark. It was teaching him in a language he could finally understand. Diane's lesson came differently. She showed up one rainy morning, standing at the shop door with a soaked umbrella and eyes that had seen too many sleepless nights. "Mike," she whispered. "Can I come in?" I nodded. She stepped inside, dripping rainwater onto the tiled floor. Her perfume was gone. Her nails were chipped. Even her voice had lost its sharp edge. "I'm sorry to drop by unannounced," she said. "I didn't know where else to go." "What happened?" I asked, handing her a towel. She took it, hesitated. I messed up. I trusted the wrong people. Thought I was investing in something real. It was a scam. I lost almost everything." I stayed quiet. She looked around the shop, the flowers, the calm music playing faintly in the background. "It's beautiful here," she said. "Peaceful." "It is," I replied. "That's what I wanted it to be." Her eyes softened. "You always were the quiet one. Guess you understood things we didn't." I smiled faintly. I just listened more than I talked. She nodded, then took a deep breath. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to see you. To say I was wrong, about you, about Mom, about everything." The honesty in her voice surprised me. She wasn't pretending anymore. I walked over to the counter and picked up a small bouquet of lilies and white roses. "Here," I said.
Take these. She frowned.
I can't pay for them. They're not for sale, I said.
They're for peace. Tears filled her eyes.
She nodded, holding the bouquet close to her chest. As she left, I watched her walk down the street, her figure fading into the drizzle. For a moment, I saw the little sister she used to be, before pride and fear took over. That's when I realized something powerful. Revenge doesn't always have to look like victory. Sometimes, it's simply the peace of knowing you didn't become like them.
Months went by.
The business continued to bloom. I hired a few local women who needed work, just like Mom once did. We expanded into wedding arrangements and sympathy flowers. Every week, I'd visit the cemetery. I'd clean her headstone, trim the grass, and leave a single rose, always red, always from her garden. One day, while kneeling there, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw Mark. He looked thinner, older, but his eyes were calm for once. He placed a small bunch of daisies beside my rose.
She liked these, he said quietly. She did, I agreed.
We stood there in silence for a long time. No words, no apologies. Just the soft sound of the wind moving through the trees. After a while he said, "Diane told me what you did for her."
That was kind. I shrugged.
It was the least I could do. He looked at me with something like shame. You know, I used to think kindness was weakness. Turns out, it's the only thing that lasts. I smiled faintly. Mom tried to tell us that.
He nodded. Yeah.
We just didn't listen. He placed his hand on the gravestone for a moment, then turned to leave.
Take care of the garden, Mike.
It's all that's real anymore.
I will, I said softly.
That night, as I locked up the shop, I looked around at everything that had grown from that same soil they once wanted to sell. The roses, the lilies, the vines climbing the fence, all of it had survived storms, droughts, and neglect.
Just like Mom.
And just like me. It struck me then, the revenge was never about proving them wrong.
It was about proving her right.
She had believed that kindness outlives cruelty, that patience outlasts pride. I hadn't seen it before, but now it was clear. She had been teaching me all along. A few months later, I received an invitation in the mail.
It was from Diane.
She was opening a small bakery in town, a new start. She wrote, "You inspired me. You showed me peace doesn't mean giving up, it means growing differently." I smiled as I read it. I sent her flowers the next morning.
No note.
Just the same lilies and white roses I'd once given her. A week later, she showed up at the shop again, this time smiling for real. "You remembered," she said. "I remember everything," I replied. We talked for a while, about Mom, about life, about how strange it felt to finally breathe without guilt. She told me Mark had found work at a smaller firm, doing honest labor for the first time in years. "He says it feels good to earn again," she said. "Then maybe he's finally home," I replied. That evening, I went back to the garden. The sky was orange, the air soft. I sat on the bench and closed my eyes. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't ache, it healed. And somewhere deep inside that quiet, I heard her voice again. Not as memory, but as peace. "You see, Michael," she used to say, "time has a way of returning what's truly yours, not when you demand it, but when you deserve it."
And she was right.
Because in that moment, surrounded by the scent of her roses, I understood. Revenge had never been my purpose. Peace had always been the destination. It's strange how life has a way of correcting itself, not through loud retribution, but through quiet balance. I never planned for revenge. It found its way through the small choices I made, through patience, and perhaps, through my mother's unseen grace. After I bought Mom's house, I decided to restore it, not just the structure, but the soul that had long been neglected. I kept her favorite curtains, the ones with little yellow flowers. I repainted the living room in the same shade of pale green she loved. I planted roses in the backyard because she used to say, "Roses are like people, they bloom best after they've been cut." I hired a small local company for the renovation. Coincidentally, it was run by a man named Carl, Linda's husband.
I didn't know it at first.
When he showed up with his team, his face turned pale as soon as he saw me. His eyes darted toward the ground, avoiding mine. You're the owner of this place?" he asked, his voice unsteady. "Yes," I said quietly. "This was my mother's house." He didn't say much after that. The next few days, I could see the weight of realization pressing on him. He worked harder than any of his men, making sure every corner was perfect. He even stayed late one evening to repair a leak in the kitchen sink that wasn't part of the job. When the work was done, he approached me hesitantly. "You don't owe me the remaining payment," he said. "Just, thank you for letting me work here." I looked at him for a long moment. The old me might have reminded him of how his wife and brother-in-law treated me, how they took everything that wasn't theirs. But I didn't need to. Life had already spoken. "Carl," I said calmly, "I pay people for their work, not for their apologies.
Send me the invoice."
He nodded, his eyes glistening, and left quietly. A few months later, I learned that Linda and her husband had sold their house. Their business had collapsed under debt. Richard had lost his job after some questionable accounting practices came to light. The same arrogance that once gave them power had become their undoing. Meanwhile, I had found a quiet peace in small things. I spent my evenings sitting on the porch, sipping tea, listening to the sound of the wind through the trees. Sometimes I'd talk to Mom, not out loud, but in my mind. "Things worked out, Mom," I'd whisper inside. "Not the way I imagined, but the way you would have wanted." It wasn't about money or success anymore. It was about dignity. About understanding that patience is not weakness, it's strength disguised as silence. A few months later, something unexpected happened. One rainy afternoon, I heard a knock at the door. It was Richard. He looked thinner, older, and there was no trace of pride left in his posture. "Can we talk?" he asked softly. I let him in. We sat in the living room, the same place where years ago, Mom had pleaded with us to stay united. He looked around and said, "You fixed the house up well. It feels like her again." I nodded. That was the point. He hesitated, then finally spoke. "I wanted to apologize, David. We were wrong. Linda and we were blinded by money. When Mom passed, we thought we were taking what we deserved. But now I see, we lost everything that mattered." For a while, I didn't say anything. I just looked at the man who used to look down on me. My brother, my rival, my family. "I forgave you long ago," I said quietly. "Not for your sake, but for mine. Carrying bitterness is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die." He looked at me surprised. "How do you live with so much calm, David?" I smiled faintly. "Because Mom taught me something you never understood, that silence can speak louder than any argument." He nodded slowly. There was a peace between us that didn't need words. When he left, I knew that the chapter had finally closed. A year later, I turned the house into a small care home for elderly people who had no family. I called it Grace Haven, after Mom. The first resident was a kind old lady named Margaret, who reminded me of her. Same gentle eyes, same way of folding her hands while talking. Every time I walked through those halls, I felt her presence, not as a memory, but as a living energy. The home became a place of warmth, laughter, and quiet companionship. Local people began donating furniture, books, and decorations. Even Carl and Richard contributed, not for redemption, but perhaps because they too were learning what true peace meant. One evening, as I sat in the garden surrounded by blooming roses, a soft wind brushed against my face. The air carried a familiar scent, the scent of Mom's favorite tea. It felt as though she was sitting beside me again. I closed my eyes and said softly, "You were right, Mom. Life has its own justice. We just need to wait." And in that moment, I realized, revenge doesn't always wear the face of triumph. Sometimes, it looks like forgiveness. Sometimes, it feels like peace. Because the best revenge is not proving others wrong, it's living in a way that proves your heart was right all along. From then on, every person who entered Grace Haven carried a story of loss, of regret, of rediscovery. I listened, comforted, and shared my own when needed. I told them how I once thought silence was emptiness, until I learned it was full of wisdom. That house, once filled with loneliness, now echoed with gentle laughter and quiet gratitude. It was no longer a place of regret, it was a sanctuary of renewal. And every evening before turning in, I'd light a candle near Mom's photograph.
Not out of sorrow,
but out of gratitude, for the pain, the lessons, and the peace that followed. Because sometimes, silence isn't what remains after loss. It's what teaches us how to live again.
Lesson.
Sometimes silence is the best revenge, because peace unsettles those who tried to disturb it. It's been 7 years since that quiet afternoon when I reopened my mother's house and began rebuilding not just walls, but meaning. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges, and I've come to realize that what once felt like punishment was, in truth, preparation. When I walk through Grace Haven now, I see her reflection everywhere. In the way sunlight touches the curtains she once sewed. In the sound of laughter echoing down the hallway. In the trembling hands of an old man who asks for another cup of tea, just like she used to. People often ask me how I found peace after everything. I tell them it wasn't a single moment. It was a series of small choices, to let go, to understand, to forgive without needing an apology. I learned that forgiveness isn't about others deserving it, it's about freeing yourself from the weight of their mistakes. There are days when I still think about my brother Richard and Linda. They live quietly now in a small town nearby. Their business never recovered, but they've started anew, humbler this time. Sometimes Richard visits Grace Haven. He doesn't say much, just sits on the porch with me, sipping coffee, both of us lost in our thoughts. There's no bitterness anymore, just an understanding that life teaches through balance, not blame. One evening he said, "You turned her house into something beautiful, David. She'd be proud." I smiled. Maybe she just wanted us to learn that love is meant to be shared, not owned. He nodded, and for the first time in decades, I saw peace in his eyes. I've kept my mother's old diary in the nightstand beside my bed. I found it during the renovation, hidden behind the dresser. Her handwriting is soft, uneven in places. On the last page, she had written, "My boys will learn, maybe not now but one day, that kindness outlives anger." I must have read that line 100 times. It reminded me that she never expected perfection from us. Only growth. She believed that even in betrayal, there is an opportunity to heal, if one chooses patience over pride. And perhaps that's what I've done all these years. I didn't rise above them by winning. I rose by understanding. There's a quiet rhythm to my days now. I wake up early, open the windows, let in the morning light. The smell of coffee fills the air, mingled with the faint scent of roses from the garden. I walk through the home, greeting the residents by name. Some remember me. Some don't. But every smile I receive feels like a fragment of my mother's love finding its way back to me. Sometimes I sit in her old chair, the one by the window where she used to knit, and I imagine her sitting beside me. She doesn't speak, but her silence says enough. She'd tell me that life doesn't always give us what we want, but it gives us what we need to become who we're meant to be. And she'd be right. There's something deeply humbling about realizing that revenge, when left in the hands of time, becomes justice, quiet, graceful, and beyond control. I didn't destroy anyone. I didn't humiliate or expose them. I simply lived well. I honored her memory. I found peace where others found regret. The same silence that once felt like a punishment has become my greatest teacher. It taught me that you don't need to raise your voice to make your point. That not responding is sometimes the strongest response of all. In the end, silence doesn't mean weakness. It means wisdom, the kind that comes when you stop trying to win and start trying to understand. A few weeks ago, one of the residents at Grace Haven, an old woman named Eleanor, said something that stayed with me. You know, David, she said, smiling softly, you walk like a man who has forgiven the world.
I chuckled.
Maybe I have, Eleanor. Or maybe I just learned that holding grudges is too heavy for an old back. She laughed, and in that sound, I heard life, imperfect, unpredictable but beautiful. At night, before I go to bed, I light a candle near my mother's photograph. It's a ritual that grounds me. I don't pray for anything anymore. I just say thank you, for the lessons, for the pain that shaped me, for the silence that healed me. Because now I know what true revenge looks like. It's not a victory you announce. It's a peace you earn. And as the candle flickers, I whisper quietly, Mom, I kept my promise. I waited. And you were right, life found its own justice. Then I close my eyes, letting the silence fill the room. But this time, it's not the silence of loss. It's the silence of peace, the kind that comes when a man finally forgives not just others, but himself. Final reflection/life lesson. Sometimes silence is the best revenge, not because it hurts others, but because it heals you. Peace isn't won through words or pride, but through the quiet strength of letting go. When you choose calm over chaos, you don't lose, you transcend.